Hey, welcome to episode 21 of Track Records. Yes, we made it that far, and our baby is now old enough to drink. As usual, your hosts are Kenny and Barry. And Barry, if you care to pick up where we left off last time when you were so rudely interrupted.
Yeah, I was talking about some recent music-related movies that I'd seen that I dug. The first one was that Jimmy Carter Rock and Roll President movie that came out about 2 or 3 years ago. And the gist of the movie is how into music Jimmy Carter was. He was friends with Dylan, good friends with the Allman Brothers, Marshall Tucker Band. Who else was featured? Oh, Jimmy Buffett. And there was a couple other pretty prominent artists that he was good friends with, and they'd come and visit him in the governor's mansion in Georgia before he was president or when he was running for president. And it's really pretty fascinating, not only because of the musical or the music related angle, but also just how great of a person Jimmy Carter truly was and is, since he's still alive. And, you know, I think he's 95, and he's been in hospice for a year or two. And
I think he's 99, but yeah.
That old.
Yeah.
And good for him for living that long, because if anybody deserves to live that long, it's a guy like Jimmy Carter and all of the great things he did, in particular after he was president. And he just broke the mold for what you think of politicians are as human beings.
I think much like when we were talking about like the Fleetwood Mac thing being sort of a 1 in a million, I think the idea of someone like Jimmy Carter being elected president was, these days, it used to happen much more in the past, but these days is sort of a 1 in a million. It'd be hard to see that happening again.
It really is. Yeah, it really is 1 in a million, and pretty incredible that he was able to become president. It goes into his whole story, of course, and his family story, Rosalind, and he partnered up and were such incredible givers as people with their Habitat for Humanity efforts. I mean, they would literally be out there pounding nails on these houses they're building for Habitat for Humanity. And anyway, that was just one of the ones that I watched recently that I think is really worth checking out if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, and so I was checking out to see where it's on, and it's on a couple different platforms for rent. So I will check it out at some point. I also there's a classic picture I love, which I've emailed you, which is of Amy Carter with the Ramones, because she was a big Ramones fan, but she was only 15, so she wasn't allowed to go to one of their shows. But they let her in at a sound check, and so she met the band. And there's a classic photo from that.
So that's the photo you just sent me?
Yeah.
Okay. The context was totally lost on me because I didn't realize it was Amy Carter.
Right. And why would you? I mean, that would be, like, when's the last time you even thought about, like, except for having watched the documentary, of course, like you wouldn't have even thought of her. So
not too much. Although, we're old enough to remember when Carter was president, and Amy was in the picture quite a bit. She was a young girl then. She's probably around our age, but more prominently featured in this movie is her brother Chip, and he was a huge Dylan fan, and I think that was one of the reasons that there was a connection between Dylan and Jimmy. I think it all started from Chip's love of Dylan music, and then he subsequently got his dad Jimmy Carter into Dylan, and then Dylan, I guess, caught wind of it and ended up visiting them either in the White House or the governor's mansion when he's governor. But it's really cool stuff.
The movie wasn't focused on Jimmy's brother Billy.
No, Billy wasn't even. He was in a couple of the photos, but he was not really talked about much.
We call that whitewashing. Brother? I have no brother.
Well, I don't know if it was that, or he just wasn't really part of the music related aspect of this movie, which is really, it's called Jimmy Carter Rock and Roll President. So there really was a music angle, which is pretty damn cool. And I wasn't aware of it, that's for sure.
I knew some of that. I definitely knew, I remember him like having, connections and friendships with certain artists and bands and all. And I think Was he involved at all with Farm Aid?
Um, I don't recall it being talked about in the movie.
Okay, because that's the
Um,
sort of thing you could see him obviously being involved
yeah,
with. So,
yeah,
but
he
I
was
wasn't
good.
sure.
He was good friends with Willie, so
Yeah,
yeah, but I don't recall him being um, directly involved with Farm
Wi-
Aid.
Willie Nelson is one of those guys where he's one of those artists where I like his music when it's sung by somebody else.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah,
You don't like
I
Willie's
do not
music?
like his voice at all.
Really?
But Patsy Cline's version of Crazy, that's fantastic. I love that. So I like his songwriting. I just don't care. And I've had multiple opportunities to see him, since living here, and I don't go just because I don't like his voice. So.
Wow, that's amazing.
And I think that was the case for a lot of people with Dylan when Dylan was first, making his mark, and hence all those albums. The Hollies sing Dylan, and so sings Dylan, and this person sings Dylan, and the Birds. I think it was try to, get good songs to people who were more, with them.
Commercially viable.
Yeah. So
I have a handful of those late 60s Dylan cover records. The best one is by the Sound Symposium.
and
And
there's
it's like
so many of them.
these really cheesy, almost lounge versions,
Yeah.
or Muzak version of Dylan songs. But I actually eat that stuff up. I love that stuff. As cheesy as it can be. Um, another movie I wanted to mention is a documentary that came out, I think, about 15 years ago, and it's simply titled Joy Division. And coincidentally, it's about the band Joy Division. Um, I don't know how into Joy Division you are or were, but it just
was very much. I will say
okay.
I don't listen to much these days, but at one point I was really like, when I was in college, I listened to a lot of Joy Division.
Mhm.
So thankfully I didn't leap out the window. So
um, it's a really good music doc, and it reminded me how truly great and unique that band was, and they've always been solidly in the top five of my all-time favorite
wow.
bands.
Okay.
And this seeing this documentary reminded me why, because I'm not pulling out Joy Division records every day and listening to them. They had a pretty small discography,
Very small.
and I know all their stuff by heart, and so I'm not necessarily listening to them a lot these days, but man, it really hammered home how truly unique they were as a band, and
They're one of
just
those
so
bands.
good.
Not only did I never see them, but I don't know anyone personally who ever saw them.
Well, they never played over here in the States, of course.
Yeah. And so
Uh,
I just, and that was, and there were bands I certainly would have seen if they had. Another one was Kate Bush. She never toured the States. And I certainly would have seen her because I was a big Kate Bush fan as well. So it's just a shame. And so I was saying about Willie Nelson, I don't like his voice, but I do like his songs. So with Joy Division, I really like Joy Division very much. I do not care for New Order, the band. As we know, they became after Ian Curtis's death. So
New Order, I think they put out a single and a couple EPs and a record, a full-length LP shortly after Ian Curtis died, and I think all of those are actually really good, but that's only because they sound probably they probably are basically Joy Division records without Ian Curtis singing. Once they got past that, though, um, man, they just got so shitty, so lame, so
yeah,
quickly.
yeah,
It became that really cheesy 80s dance music that
it was
just
weird. Yeah,
it was the exact opposite of why Joy Division was so good and so compelling. New Order just completely lost it,
yeah, it's so
unfortunately.
strange. And imagine if after Kurt Cobain died, if they had gone on to like form like basically an 80s dance band or 90s dance band, I guess that would have been so bizarre, you know.
Yeah, it's weird, really strange how that worked out. But and this goes back to one of our conversations last week. They actually finally had some commercial success, huge commercial success
Would
after Ian
New Order.
Curtis died, and they
Yeah.
became New
Yeah.
Order because it's
Yep.
3/4 of Joy Division,
Yep.
and they finally broke through. And
Yeah.
further evidence that once something becomes popular with the mainstream, it usually kind of sucks oftentimes.
Although it's so funny because like all the Clash fans were screaming at the Clash they sold out when they recorded an album, because at that point punk was like you didn't even like you shouldn't even make an album. And it's like okay, like there's you got to be reasonable. There's a fine line. I was thinking about when you were saying how when you went punk, you got rid of a lot of your rock albums.
Out go the AC/DC
Yeah,
records.
yeah. No, and one of the ones you mentioned was Boston, which, as you know, as I've said, is the first concert I ever went to, the first one I ever paid for my own ticket to go see. And the interesting thing about Boston is also in that Fleetwood Mac in terms of the bizarreness of how it happened, of Tom Schultz, an MIT grad, like building his own sound system, recording basically all the parts, writing the songs, recording the parts, and then finding some bandmates and convincing a studio to release the LP. And they insisted he record in LA, but he wanted to stay in Boston where he had his studio. So he'd fly out to LA, pretend to be recording out there, go back to Boston, get the stuff, then bring it back to LA and say, here it is.
I'd never heard that. That's a great anecdote.
So, but they're another one where like it's hard to believe a band came out of that, and they were huge. They were the first band to ever sell out Madison Square Garden their first time playing there, because they went from playing like 3,000 seat clubs to playing huge arenas.
Biggest selling debut record of all time, I think, still to this day.
I think still, yeah, but it's certainly top three still. So regardless, I'm just amazing. And then after that, their other albums not that great. So it's interesting. And so sometimes you have your debut album where it's all you have, and then you have to come out with a second album, you've got nothing. But in the Tom Petty documentary, Jimmy Iovine, you know who Jimmy Iovine is, right? Of course. Yes, the producer. And he's talked about how often it's the third record that really is the great one. And so he talked about when he worked with Bruce and it was Born to Run. When he worked with Tom Petty, and it was Damn the Torpedoes. When he worked with Patti Smith, and it was Easter. And so that got me thinking. I was like, oh yeah, and the Clash with London Calling, and it doesn't always hold true by any means, but it also makes sense. It where your first album, you're trying this, and then okay, that didn't work, that sort of worked. Your second album, you're sort of okay, well, what if we go this way? And then your third album, you sort of put it all together. I think that certainly happened with Bruce.
It's oftentimes when a band or an artist will really solidly find their identity is by that third record.
Yeah.
And sometimes sooner, sometimes later. But yeah, I think there's probably a ton of examples. Neil Young, his third record, After the Gold Rush.
Yep.
Does it get any better than that? Probably not.
Yeah. And again, he had to just sort of find his way to that. Whereas there were a lot of bands, particularly new wave or punk bands, where they had like one album full of material. They released everything on that one album, and then suddenly they had to do a follow-up album, and they had bubkas. And so it's interesting that those seem to me the two most common ways. You either shot your wad in the first album and had nothing, or you sort of slowly found your way, figured it out with a third album, and then boom, went from there.
So I can't help but go back to your comment about Willie's voice.
Yeah.
So I understand how people can be turned off to Dylan's voice, especially when he first came on the scene. Nobody sounded like that, and especially today, the way he sounds now, it's like fuck. I don't think anybody could stand his singing. I know I can't now. His croaking basically, but Willie's voice is so pleasant. I don't see how you can make that distinction to like, I just don't like his voice.
I really don't like it.
First time I've ever heard.
So I'll give you, that's funny. I'll say a couple of things. One is when I was in high school and used to listen to records while studying, and I would listen to them loud. And I remember my mom coming home one time, and like I was playing the Pistols like really loud, and she's fine. She's ignoring it. She's just doing her thing and all. But then at one point I put on a Neil Young record. She said, "Take that off." She said, "I cannot stand that man's voice." And it was so funny after listening to Johnny Rotten to then like she could deal with Johnny Rotten. She could not deal with Neil Young. And another example for me was it took me a while. Now I am a fan of his voice, but it took me a while with Leonard Cohen. And again, I love his songs. His songwriting is just amazing. But if at first it really was listening to Judy Collins or whoever else doing his songs, I really appreciate it. And then finally I got in. Seeing him live is what got me into his own his voice. But I think a lot of voices are more of an acquired taste, as opposed to Paul McCartney, you know.
And I would argue, or not argue, but concur that a lot of the ones that are an acquired taste end up being the ones you love the most because they're the most unique. And sure, Dylan, you listen to the freewheeling Bob Dylan for the first time in whatever 1962 or 3. It's like, what the hell is this? And who is this guy? And with this weird sounding voice that's really off-putting. But it, it's weird that you could get to a point where you find something like that to be totally compelling, and it's the unique nature of it that draws you in eventually.
And then he changes his voice altogether on Nashville Skyline.
Yeah, and singing with Johnny Cash and doing country songs, and
and just the different way he sings entirely.
Oh yeah,
so it's
which
so
is
funny.
Great in itself.
Yeah,
but he's almost like a country crooner on that record.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to see the change. Another voice which I loved right away, but I could definitely see people not liking, was Rod Stewart. Because that's again, like I said, as opposed to someone like Paul McCartney, who has your more run of the mill nice voice.
It's just kind of syrupy and easily digestible.
Exactly. Yep. And so no knock on him. I mean, he's a good singer.
Sure, of course. But, God, maybe I'm amazed. The studio version, maybe one of the best vocal performances ever, in my opinion.
And it was supposed to be a Beatles song. It's interesting because it's supposed to be a Beatles song. And when you watch Get Back and all, you wonder, like, Ringo said it was time for us to go our way. He said I would have stayed.
What the fuck else does Ringo have to do?
Exactly.
Although ironically, he was the one who had the first big hit after the Beatles broke up. Big hit album. I think he had either the first #1 single or the first #1 album after they broke up.
He had a couple hits.
Actually quite a few in the early 70s.
It Ain't Easy.
Postcard.
Yeah, and remember he did a cover of You're 16.
And oh God, I think there was at least a couple more. But anyway.
But it's interesting, like, when we often talk about the what if, what if they hadn't replaced Pete Best? What if they hadn't replaced, what if Keith Moon hadn't shown up? What if, and what if the Beatles stayed together? Would they, let's say they'd said, fuck it, we're going to stay together for one more album. Would they have then said, you know what, we can make it, and they would have kept doing albums? Or would that have been it? It's just sort of interesting. Like, it'd be interesting to have a crystal ball to be able to say, well, what if this had happened? What if that had happened?
Sure.
It's amazing when bands stay together. That surprises me more. REM or U2, how long have they been together with the same lineup?
Well, REM, of course, is no longer together.
Right. But how many years was it?
Well, they lost their original drummer in the 90s, but still together a long time, of course.
And U2?
Yeah, still, still together with the original lineup. But awful, just.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I'm not talking about the quality. I'm just saying, it's much easier to be the Stones and be together because you never see each other, and they're a corporation more than they're a band. But was there a band you were in where you really liked the guys a lot and you could have been in that band forever, or a band where you're like, I'm happy now, but there's no way I'm going to be here 3 years from now, no matter how we do?
Yeah, most of them I could have stayed in forever if they had progressed to a point where it became viable financially as a career, that sort of thing. Always got along with all my bandmates for the most part. There's a couple exceptions, but very, very few.
And you have friends who are musicians, the same experience for them, like for Dove, for example?
Dov. Well, you'd have to talk to him about it, but I think his opinion on that, well, in fact, I know it differs from mine drastically. So if we ever get him on this thing, he can talk about it.
Because I've always said, I think that's a tough road, man.
It is. It's like being in a bunch of different relationships, especially when you're a struggling band who is doing tons of shows and touring and making records and what have you, but not really able to make it financially feasible. So it's you're pouring your heart and soul into it, but not getting much payback, and so it's a bit of a grind.
Yeah,
And
I'm sure.
if you don't like hanging out with the people you're doing this with, it gets a lot worse, or it takes
It's
a lot of the joy out of it.
I'm sure, but it's also interesting as far as the money goes. I'll never forget this comment Bruce made. There's a live at the Roxy interview. There's a live at the Roxy bootleg, and there's a radio station interview in between sets, and they're talking to Bruce about, hey, you're making it now, and like, it's not great. And you're making more than $500 a night now. And Bruce said, yeah, but when you make more than $500 a night, you have more than $500 a night problems. And so I think it's interesting that even when also, like, you do Born to Run, massive record, huge success, you're on the cover of Time and Newsweek, and all this stuff, and now guess what, where's the next album? And that's a lot of pressure, I think, to keep coming up with that sort of stuff, and more so, I think, in music than in anything. When you've released a movie as a director, I don't think someone goes, when's the next one? When you write a book, I don't think they say as much, when's the next one? The albums, it's always, what are you gonna do for the next one?
And it falls solely on the artist, whether it's a solo artist, like, I don't know, say Bowie or a Neil Young. It's falling on their shoulders. Or if it's a band, say it's an REM, it's falling solely on their shoulders, as opposed to something that has a much larger scale, like a movie. There's the studio involved, and all the other creative people along with the director. So yeah, I see what you mean. I think the pressure must be greater, but
and but
I mean, what a
yeah,
problem to have.
Yeah, no, I know, but
Bruce
it's also
can't come up with a record after Born to Run.
It's also interesting when you're someone like Pete Townsend, where, guess what, your job is to write the songs, and if you don't have the songs, that album's not coming.
Yeah, but it's all part of being an artist, though, yeah. And it's what they've signed up for. So, I've certainly, I understand that there'd be pressure, but I certainly don't have any sympathy for anyone like that. I mean, real pressure is, if you're struggling to put food on the table,
sure.
And you lose your job, and you have to go out and find a job to feed your family. Now, I would have sympathy for.
Yeah, no, obviously it has to do with within this confine, within this universe. This is, like,
gotcha.
But I just think and I've always said, I think there's a million bands out there, a million artists who are awesome, and I've never heard, and I never will hear, just because they just didn't get that break. And a million, actors, or, sure. directors, or writers, or, poets, or field. Yeah. And so how much of life is luck? Both good and bad.
I think the life of an artist, I forget what the percentage is, but somebody, and I forget who said it. In fact, you probably know who said it. It's something like, being successful in the music business is like, oh God, what was it? Like 90% luck, 5% talent, and 5% timing, or something to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because like they talk, like in baseball, when you've got three good prospects, they always say one's going to do well, one's going to do poorly, one's going to get hurt. That is what usually happens. And are you going to be the guy who does well, or the guy who does badly, or the guy who gets hurt? And I don't know what the percentage would be for bands, but again, if you're an A&R guy at a label, in particular in the older days, because that's really how it worked then, you were listening to a million tapes. And there could be even the tape you would have liked. They just caught you on the wrong day. They caught you on the day you just found out your wife is sleeping with some other guy. And you put on this tape and you're like, I fucking hate this. Whereas if they'd caught you when, your daughter was graduating high school, you might have said, I love this. And he was the guy, he was the gatekeeper. He was the guy who was going to let you into the golden studio or not.
Yeah, would make or break it for any particular band. Another movie I wanted to mention, music movie. Yep. It's called Chasing Train, and it's a John
I've seen that
documentary. Okay, very good.
Yes,
very
excellent.
Good. So much great footage of Coltrane and his bands playing from the 50s and 60s, of course.
I was
during
surprised how
its
good the
heyday.
footage was.
Yeah, that I was too, and I think that's what drew me into this movie. Was not the talking head stuff. You know, every jazz documentary has, okay, Wynton Marsalis,
Yeah.
you know, the so-called expert. Of course, he's going to be one of the talking heads.
Yep.
Who's going to be singing the praises of John Coltrane, or who's the teacher at Yale? I forget his name.
Okay.
Anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. What I found so good was the stuff about his personal life and his connection to his stepdaughter was one of the talking heads that I found pretty insightful. Hearing this now, you know, elderly woman who was talking about being raised by him. He had married her mother when she was a little girl, and basically raised him from, I don't know, the age of 8 to 19 or whatever. That was his first wife, and he ended up divorcing her and then meeting Betty, and their musical partnership was talked about. And just you know, he's such a great artist, great jazz artist, but also has a really interesting story. The whole thing about him playing with Miles, and Miles originally, after he'd played with him for a year or two, Coltrane was such a junkie at the time that Miles had to boot him out of the band. All that stuff I found fascinating, and it's a well done documentary for sure.
It's sad, man, how prevalent heroin was in the jazz world in the 50s and 60s. Like, you know, it's almost like people were shooting up as much as they were drinking hooch. I mean, it was crazy how many people were junkies. You know, Charlie Parker, fuck, what a talented musician, and John Coltrane, and you know, and everyone like tried it.
Miles was a raging junkie.
Yeah.
By the time he had kicked out Coltrane, though, for the same thing, he had already kicked the habit.
He had gotten clean.
But you name any of the jazz artists who are considered the greats, almost to a T, they've all been junkies, or all were junkies at one point. And some, of course, a ton of them died as junkies, but the ones that, you know, kicked the habit are some of the ones who are, you know, known as the greatest jazz artists of all time.
That's
being one of them.
Certainly exceptions, like Dave Brubeck.
I can't imagine Dave Brubeck was ever shooting up heroin, but that's a good question. Who knows?
Can I swear to that? No, but in my understanding, my learning, my reading, that's never come to light.
He had to have been around it, being
I'm
such
sure
a prominent jazz artist. But that's a pretty funny image.
But but I really like Dave Brubeck.
Me too.
And I really like Chet Baker's another guy I really like. You know, and that's the cool thing, like Bill Evans, like, you know, there's so many different jazz artists, so much different. People think jazz is like one sound, and it's so not. You know, Dizzy Gillespie, you know, is so different than, like, you know, John Coltrane or Sonny Rollins, or, you know, I mean, and it's you know, it's jazz is so wonderful. It's just sad that, you know, part of the whole reason for heroin is this whole socioeconomic background of jazz performers being African American and not being treated the same way, you know, and having much less opportunity.
I don't know if I would have to disagree with that as far as the jazz guys go. From everything I've read and the documentaries and stuff that I've seen, most of the jazz guys who got into heroin thought that they were trying to emulate Charlie Parker, and they thought that that's what was making Charlie Parker so creative and so great. So from everything that I know about it, that's the reason they would all start trying it, and then they'd get hooked.
I think that I definitely think that's partially true. I don't think that's the overwhelming thing, but certainly you hear that about, you know, Keith Richards as well. You know, people wanting to like play guitar like Keith Richards and thinking heroin is the gateway to doing that. You know. So
and they all, you know, quickly found out that you know, that
Uh,
was
uh,
that wasn't the golden ticket.
yeah, I did a lot of drugs in my lifetime. I never touched that. There was no way I was putting a needle in my arm
Yeah,
or messing with something that dark. Like I never like there was never even a moment of temptation. You know,
I've
so.
never been around it either.
But you
So
said
I've never
one of
tried
the
it.
guys in one of your bands,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, who was always on
A
the
bass
nod when you
player.
get there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he wasn't for the first year or two.
Okay.
And then apparently he had had that problem before I joined that band. That was one of my bands in Seattle when I
Mm.
first moved up there. And for the first year or two, he remained clean. And then suddenly he got back into it. And the guitarist and I would show up at practice, and he would literally be just out on the sofa that was in our practice room. You couldn't wake him up.
Mm.
And I was so naive at the time that I leading up to that, there were other times where he just seemed really out of it, really tired. And he'd always say it was because he was so tired from his job, because he had a manual labor job. And I always thought that's what was going on. It was, then I quickly realized what the real problem was. And he, at one point, it got so bad that he stole our guitarist's guitar
Mm.
and took it to a pawn shop
Mm.
to get money to go score junk.
And
Um,
that's what
that was the one
happens.
time I was around it, and it was almost stereotypical, like Seattle,
Mm.
stealing instruments to take
Right.
to a pawn shop,
Mm.
nodding out,
It's
at bad
it's
practice.
sad what it drives you to. One of the reasons that like obviously he was going to have a lot of guitar parts anyway, but one of the reasons micktaylor played so much guitar on Sticky Fingers, for example, was because Keith was totally unreliable at that point. And so he played certain parts that he wasn't going to play. He plays all the guitar on Moonlight Mile, for example. Um, and yeah, that's you can do blow and you can get by. You can drink and you can get by. But you can do acid. You can drop acid and you can get by. You know, watch Woodstock. but but I think heroin's
Eventually,
yeah,
yeah. It from how everybody describes it, it is like the greatest feeling
yeah.
ever, and
I heard
hence,
that and I still was like, nope.
yeah,
And it
yeah,
almost ruined Clapton's career. Is
that's
another
right.
one.
Oh,
Townsend actually helped.
Pete
You know,
Townsend actually was addicted to heroin himself in the
r-
late '70s.
yeah,
Yeah, he
but
had a major problem,
which
and
is
he
funny because he got
talked
helped
about it.
Eric get clean in the early '70s,
Hmm.
and so
Yeah,
you'd think if you got someone that clean, you wouldn't fall prey to it, and yet,
well, that's
you know,
the insidious draw of
yeah,
that drug, apparently.
yeah,
But yeah, it's taken far too many great musicians,
yeah.
and just
The
people in
Pretenders,
general.
the
Yeah,
Pretenders, man, I
two of the
love.
originals.
Yeah, I love the Pretenders. I saw them, as I've told you. They came to Boston. They played 3 nights in a row. I went every night. I
Mhm.
loved their first album. I was a huge Pretenders fan. I loved everything about it. I loved
Clearly,
the cover photo. I liked every song. I liked everything about the Pretenders. And then James Honeyman Scott died, their guitar player. Then Pete Farndon died, their bass player, both of overdoses. And they replaced him, and it just wasn't the same band. The second album's pretty good. And after that, the third album's listenable, but it was,
barely.
straight down. Yeah. James Honeyman Scott was such a good guitar player. And he's actually the one, by the way, when they were playing in I think it was in Milwaukee, and the Violent Femmes weren't known. No one knew who they were. They were busking outside where the Pretenders were going to play, and James Honeyman Scott liked them and introduced them to Chrissy, and she said, all right, you guys come on before the opening band. And that's how they got their break. So once more, luck playing a huge factor. And that first Violent Femmes album, that is a great album. Are you a fan?
I am.
Yeah, that
I
first
like.
album is so good.
I have. I think there are 3 records after that as well.
Yeah,
That's how much of a fan I am.
yeah.
Not one of my favorite bands by
No,
any means,
no,
but
I can see that, but
enough to pick up the records.
there are certain bands. Another one that like they're not one of my favorite bands by any means, but the first couple White Stripes albums, I think are excellent. I really like that, and I saw them a couple times live, and they're really good. And what don't you like about them?
I just don't like anything about them. They just rub me the wrong way. I don't like any of their tunes. I just I think they were a gimmick that somehow caught on, and
I knew that would bother you. I knew that the whole this is a gimmick. You got to get past that.
but I don't mind gimmicks
Okay.
per se, as
Yeah.
long as if I like the music. There's
Yeah.
no more gimmick. There's no more gimmicky band than Devo, and their first two records are two of my favorite records of all time still. But let's just say the White Stripes music did not speak to me. There was just something to me about it and I can't really even articulate it. It's just something about it that sounds contrived to me.
Okay. I think he's a great
And
guitar player, great
drumming
singer.
sucks.
She could be a better drummer. There's no question about that.
And I, just, oh, she's got this great spirit or whatever. I just don't buy that. It's just not musical, and it brings the music down because she's such a shitty drummer, in my opinion.
Yeah.
A lot of people swear by the White Stripes. I value your opinion. You like them a lot. I didn't know you liked them though.
Yeah. Yeah, Kim turned me on to them. And again, we saw them a couple times, and they're really good live. Another band I saw when I was 15, 16, 17, young, that my brother, my older brother, invited me to join them all to go see Talking Heads, which when your older brother does that, that's like, you go, like, that's so cool. And it wasn't just the Talking Heads were great. The opening band was a band no one had ever heard of, named the B-52s. They didn't have an album out yet. And I remember Fred Schneider, the lead singer, comes out with this like walkie-talkie like thing going doot 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 for the beginning of Rock Lobster. Yeah. And we're like, who is this guy? What is he doing? What the hell's going on? And the music starts, and at first people are like almost laughing. And then at a certain point, the laughter turns to, wait a second, this is fucking cool. And it was interesting to see that happen.
How the audience flipped.
Yeah. Because they're ready to mock him, and they were starting to mock him, and then they're like, and then you saw the sort of ripple effect, and then they ended up playing, I think it was Rock Lobster, they ended up playing one or two of their songs twice because they didn't have enough songs, and yet the audience was yelling for them. So
it's so funny that you bring them up, because as we were talking about last week, I got a cassette deck installed into my Jeep, and what was the first, I'm not kidding you, what was the first tape I pulled out of my selection of tapes to play once I got a working tape deck in my Jeep? It was the first B-52s record.
That's funny.
Which I have an original cassette of it from whatever. I found it at a thrift store or something. And again, much like that Joy Division documentary, I forgot how great that record was. I hadn't listened to it in 100 years, and that is such a great rock record.
Their first two albums, really,
that one
really
in particular,
good.
Though, is the one that I love. It Wild Planet's okay, I think.
But once again, starting like they started,
a quick decline.
Yeah, but the first couple are really good.
And speaking of lyrics, some of the lyrics are so funny, like that, and it's poignant. It's such a silly lyric, but the way I guess it's Cindy Wilson who's singing it. Why don't you dance? Why won't you dance with me? I'm not no Limburger. And then she keeps repeating it, and it's it almost brings goosebumps to me. It's sung with such passion, and it's such a silly lyric. Like, what does that even mean? Do I smell like cheese so you won't dance with me? I mean, what the fuck is that? But God, it's poignant as hell. Yeah, you know which song I'm talking about.
Right? Dance This Mess Around.
The whole record from start to finish. I have,
you cannot sit still listening to that record.
Yeah.
That's the only problem with being in the car. That's what I was going to say. That's the problem with having it in the good. Because if you're home and you put that on, you got to get up. As Gen X sings, with a record selection and a mirror reflection, I'm dancing with myself.
I always thought that was just about jerking off. Oh, I guess it could be with the mirror reflection. You're jerking off in front of the mirror.
Yeah,